Hello, everyone. Bishop Raymond Swan stood at the pulpit that Sunday like a man who had carried a mountain in his chest for decades. The church light soft against the careful lines on his face, the congregation leaning forward as if they could hold him up with their breath. And when he finally began to speak, the words were small at first. A single confession whispered into a microphone that had heard thousands of sermons, but never anything like this. "I have kept a secret," he said, and the hush that followed felt almost like the sea pulling back before a storm. The rumor mill had been merciless for years in the little city that loved and vilified him in equal measure. Whispers about money, whispers about late-night meetings, whispers about a past that didn't fit the portrait on the program cover. And for years, Raymond had weathered them with prayerful smiles, charitable gestures, and the steel of someone who knows that the work of saving souls is never tidy. But tonight, at 82, and with hands that trembled not from age alone, but from the knowledge that silence had cost people their lives, he decided the cloak of leadership had become a blade, and he would stop sharpening it on other people's backs. He told them, without flourish, how as a young preacher he had made bargains he thought were temporary. Loans taken against funds that were meant for mission trips, quick decisions to close his eyes to donors whose money smelled of compromise, the slow slide from idealism to protectionism that happens when the altar becomes also a house and you confuse the sacred with the structure that contains it. He confessed that he had used the church's influence to hide the failing businesses of friends and family, to vouch for men he suspected were dangerous because to do otherwise would mean losing them to the streets. And he admitted with a voice that broke like thin ice that one of those men had, years later, been involved in a crime that shattered a neighborhood, and Raymond had paid hush money rather than push for truth, thinking he was saving the soul of the man and, absurdly, the church itself. As he spoke, faces in the pews shifted from shock to grief. There was the woman who'd given her life savings to the soup kitchen, the young pastor who had idolized him, the mother whose son had been arrested in the raid tied to the man Raymond had shielded, and the room filled with a grief so big it was almost holy, because confession is a strange sacrament. It rips you open and makes room for others to feel the wound you carry. He went on, and it became worse, or truer, depending on how you measure such things, about youth nights canceled because of creeping debts, about the quick sale of the community center to a developer whose promises were prettier on paper than in practice, and how he had, out of fear and pride, signed away the heart of a neighborhood so the church's mortgage wouldn't stare at him every night. He told them about the marriage he'd had before his calling, a marriage that ended quietly in failure when his wife left with their little girl because he chose sermons over presents, and how he had buried that shame under new vows and a new life in the pulpit, never daring to name what he had lost. Sometimes his voice went quiet, and you could hear the old hymn-worn rafters creak, and then he said something that stopped the church like a hand pressed to the mouth. When he was 30, broken and blind with drink after a ministerial failure, he'd felt a hand on his shoulder in a barroom, a hand that belonged to a man he had later brought into the church as a youth counselor, and that man, Raymond confessed now with a bile-bright honesty, had abused children under the cover of ministry, and Raymond had known, had been terrified to speak because the man was beloved by donors, and because the thought of loss, of reputation, of revenue, of the fragile safety net they'd woven, felt to him like a death sentence to the good the church had done. So he paid, he relocated the man quietly, he counseled victims to keep silence with the gentle cruelty of the convinced, and for 30 years he had told himself that saving the church meant saving lives, until he realized that silence had cost the innocence of the children he had promised to protect, and that realization had hollowed him like a dried bone. The confession landed like a wound on the congregants. Some people's faces drained to the color of old photographs. Others had that small, furious, pleading expression people wear when they bargain silently with God. No, not him. There were gasps and rustles, and then, in the back row, a woman sobbed in a way that could not be hidden, the raw sound of a life that had been betrayed in the name of legal safety. rulings came, settlements were made, and some people left the church forever. Others stayed and built new oversight structures so that secrecy could never again be sanctified. Raymond moved out of the big house into a small apartment above the food bank he had once neglected in favor of prestige. And there he spent his last years answering letters from those he had hurt, reading names into a ledger of remembrance, and cultivating a new practice, Every Wednesday he taught the teens how to write apologies, how to make restitution, how to hold their leaders accountable without destroying the possibility of redemption, because he had come to understand that accountability is not vengeance, but a form of love that insists you don't get to keep your power while others pay for your mistakes. In the end, the story that terrified the town, that the bishop would either be lionized or destroyed, turned into something more human. Public contrition that was neither glamorous nor silent. A slow work of repair that included prison visits, court testimonies, the names of old predators read into the record, and a community that learned to build institutions that did not depend on one man's holiness. Raymond died years later, not as a hero redeemed by miraculous absolution, but as an old man who had lived the terrible and necessary project of facing what he had done. At his funeral, people cried for him, and with him, victims who refused to forgive and still attended because the work demanded witness, parishioners who had stood by after long nights of wrestling with conscience, the young pastors he'd mentored who now preached about systems rather than saviors, and the eulogy was not a whitewashing, but a mirror. He showed us, someone said, how a leader can be broken and still be useful if he is honest. That line landed like a benediction. The tragedy was vast and heartbreaking, but from it grew a new kind of church, one built on transparency and the belief that truth, however devastating, can be the river that eventually washes things clean. The camera of the world moved on as cameras always do, but in the alleys and in the small kitchens, people kept telling the story not as gossip, but as an instruction. Power must be tethered to accountability, and love without boundaries is a temptation that will always cost the most vulnerable. And that, ultimately, was the confession Raymond Swan had given them to hold. That a life of service is not proven by the public trophies on the wall, but by the hard, often ugly work of repair you do when your sins come home, and that sometimes the most heartbreaking thing a leader can do is stop pretending to be invulnerable and start being responsibly human.
Raymond continued.
Thanks for watching.
His outward image, the well-kept suits, the carefully photographed charity lunches, the awards for interfaith work, had been a priestly mask and also a prison, because when you are known as a man of mercy, you are less likely to be accused, and he had used that to shield himself as much as others. He told stories of small mercies that stained into sin, the family given a scholarship because their patriarch was a good donor, the battered woman rehoused quietly because her abuser was connected to the church board, the policies he set that were meant to manage risk but ended up managing truth. And as each item fell from his lips, the audience's love for him cracked and reformed into something rarer. Grief with edges. He explained why he had waited. Fear of shattering decades of work. Fear of being the headline that would make the smallest hands go hungry. Fear of being deemed hypocrite rather than human. And then there was the truest thing of all, the one that made the hard men in the crowd look away. He had stayed silent because he had been afraid to be small. I had to be big, he said, because the world wanted a giant, and I thought if I was big enough I could keep the monsters at bay. He told them about nights of stone-cold loneliness after service, how he wept for the children he'd failed, how he prayed not for forgiveness for himself, but for the courage to face those he'd wronged. And then he named them, slowly, one by one, the people whose names had been shuttled through his ledger and his memory. The counselor, the developer, the son in prison, the mother who wrote letters he never answered, and with each name the church felt the weight of a history that needed tending. What followed was not the dramatic collapse some had anticipated, but a painful, halting reckoning. Members stood, some with trembling hands, some with cheeks flushed by anger, and they demanded answers that were messy and rightful. Others clung to him still, because the complexity of love is that we can hold bitter truths and fierce loyalties together like someone clutching a candle in both hands. Over the next days, the tiny city around the church lit up like a nervous wire. Headlines arrived, old friends called, the national news vans that had once treated the church like a trophy returned with cameras that smelled of judgment. And Raymond, who had expected exile, received instead an unbearable human thing. People brought him the stories he had once avoided, tear-soaked confessions from victims who'd learned to breathe only after his silence ended, petitions for amends, lists of restitutions, names to report, and a typewritten stack of crimes to hand to the authorities.
And as the legal process crept in like winter, what terrified Raymond most was not the money or the paper trail, but the gaze of those children who had grown into adults with broken seams, who now wanted to know why the man they revered had let them fall. His wife, Ruth, a quiet woman who had loved him before the pulpit and had watched his compromises with a kind of sorrow reserved for mothers and believers, stood at his side, not to please the press, but because love in this story was not a tidy redemption but a daily sacrificial choosing to stay present while consequences fell. Together they opened the church's ledgers, they resigned from boards quietly that had become walls, and they began what would be decades of community repair, truth commissions, public apologies, reparations calculated not from spreadsheets alone, but from conversations where the community's hurt shaped the numbers. The hardest scenes were not the sermons that followed, but the living room apologies in small houses where Raymond went and listened for hours to stories that would not fit into a sermon, where he sat on cracked couches and let people tell him about their ruined birthdays, about the teacher they'd loved who had become a predator, about the bread they'd missed when the center closed. Sometimes they forgave him with the weariness of people who have no choice but to survive. Sometimes they could not, and those refusals were righteous and necessary. The heartbreak of it was not only for the victims or for Raymond, it was for a city that had invested its hopes and its identity in a man who had tried, disastrously, to hold everything together by lying in the seams, for the volunteers who had kept the soup kitchens warm while the truth froze in the corners, for the children who grew up thinking leaders were infallible and learned instead that saints and sinners share the same breath.